Hamish, you came from a family with a big BBC pedigree.
I did. Back at the start of the war, my father was in the London Scottish Regiment and had a slight accident and was temporarily invalided out and put on fire-watching duties at a place called Broadcasting House. And while he was there, an unexploded bomb landed, and he, along with the other fire wardens, was sent to go down from the roof down to the basement, and he got into one studio, said, "There's an unexploded bomb, get out," and the bomb exploded. He spent nearly a year in hospital after that, and instead of going back to the army, he joined the BBC on the recorded programmes side, and it was there that he met a certain Miss Hutchison, my mother.
Yes.
She came from Aberdeen and had a degree in French, German and Spanish, and managed to, I think, twist her father around her little finger, I would put it, and persuade him that the safest place for her during the war would be London. And so she joined the Latin American service, and her job was to analyse letters sent in, evaluating whether the people sending them were pro-Allies or pro-Axis, because South America was not necessarily going to be in favour of the Allied side.
No.
So, in 1947 I was born. My father continued his career, and in 1956 he got a chance to go to Nigeria as part of a training package for Nigerian broadcasters. So my brother and myself and my mother joined him in Nigeria. We lived in the east, in Enugu, and up in the north, in Kaduna, and spent a very happy time charging around the garden on our bicycles and not doing so much school. In due course, I ended up back in Aberdeen at Aberdeen University and did a degree in English, but it was a Scottish degree, so it included music, French, Russian, and a bit of German, because the Scottish education is broader, yeah. And all of those subjects ended up remarkably useful to me in my later BBC career. And actually, if I can pick up the first one, music. The thing I learnt from music and a composer and lecturer called Ian Kemp was that there's a great similarity between a radio programme and a piece of music, in that both have a beginning, a middle and an end, and it helps to get them in the right place, which isn't necessarily always the same place. But having an awareness of time and time passing is valuable, so you can ratchet up the tension or lessen it. So, after university I went and taught on voluntary service overseas in Burundi for a couple of years, teaching English, and came back and needed a job. I taught in Scotland for a short time, and then in East Acton, and I taught French and German there. And then it had always been my intention to get into the BBC. I think that Dad, I saw, had had an interesting career.
Well, you were quite close to it in East Acton.
Exactly, yes. They went later on to the rehearsal rooms there, actually, for work.
Yes. The Acton Hilton, I think as it was known.
Yes, and for future listeners to this, I think that Hilton implies a certain degree more luxury than you would actually find in East Acton.
Yes, quite.
And the same would actually also apply to the Langham, which at the time I'm speaking, which is 2024, this time the Langham is a luxury hotel. I first came across it when I, having applied to the BBC, got on the Programme Operations Assistant trainee scheme, which is a brilliant scheme for training people, a lot of them from an arts background, in the operational side of broadcasting, so that they can sit behind the glass panel and twiddle the knobs and buttons.
Yes, because being a studio manager was one of the standard routes in, wasn't it?
I hope it still is. And I've been glad, actually, that we've just been going through the COVID epidemic. And studio managers are now getting an on-air credit, which
Yes.
I really appreciate.
Yes.
So I joined 11 other people, and we arrived at the Langham, which was very functional and had a standard BBC canteen and some remarkably ancient studios, which is not a bad way to actually learn, because we were learning on some of the original OBA 8 equipment. So we were told what happens during a broadcast and what happens to that broadcast once it's recorded, or how it goes out and how it reaches the listeners. So it was a sort of quite an intense initial training period, and at the end of that we had 2 months in Broadcasting House and 2 months in Bush House, which was at the time the base of the BBC External Services,
Yes.
as they were called. In my Broadcasting House stint, I copied lots of old 78 RPM discs to tape, that modern, marvellous and probably eternal medium, which has all but disappeared now.
Yes.
And in Bush, I felt very much at home. Used a lot of languages, learnt a bit of Hausa when I was in Nigeria, learnt a bit of Kirundi when I was in Burundi, and surrounded by all the European languages. I had some Russian, and felt very much at home. And so, at the end of the training, decided to stay in Bush, and never regretted it. And when in Bush, you kind of specialised a wee bit. And I did a lot of newsroom shifts. The studio up in the 4th floor newsroom, the radio newsreel studio, had a line from Dante over the door, in Italian, naturally. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here.
Yes.
And studio managers generally reckoned this was to do with the sub-editors who would dash in at the last moment with a tape and say, this may be back to front, and it's probably been edited, although I think there was a false start or two. So we had to then find out what was on the tape and ensure that no unedited retakes, especially when accompanied by the occasional swear word, were actually ever uttered on World Service.
Quite so.
So I did that very happily for a couple of years. During that time, I also spent a lot of time working on English by radio programmes. Now, I'd heard of the English by radio unit when I came back from teaching in Burundi, and was aware that they did programmes teaching English to people who wanted to learn English, because English, certainly at the time, was very much a global language.
Yeah, sure.
Was a very valuable asset.
Was the World Service picked up there? Could people hear it in Burundi?
Yes, just. I have to say that the clearest one was Deutsche Welle, the German overseas broadcasters, who had a transmitter strategically placed in Kigali, and they came out with very, very good, balanced programmes. And we actually later had quite a bit to do with them. We had their German language producer working with us for a short time. The other broadcaster was RSA, Radio South Africa, the South African Broadcasting Corporation External Services, which pumped out pretty good propaganda for the apartheid regime. It gave me quite a good insight into sort of how to put forward a convincing case for what you're doing, which the BBC World Service tried not to do. So
tried not to?
In
what sense?
I would say that the World Service was very much aware of governments and tried to avoid pumping out propaganda. Wasn't always successful by any means, but was aware of the overall issues at the time, and obviously that changes over the time. Yeah, no. So I would say that the World Service did really pretty well. Now I know that going around at the moment there are all sorts of sort of theories, criticisms, re-evaluations, and that is fine. But we were not pumping out propaganda.
Good old BBC.
It was the
balanced
news
business.
broadcast from London.
Yeah.
Now, broadcast from London conveys quite a lot. It's not the news from Cairo. It's not the news from Beijing. Not the news from Moscow. But the news itself from Moscow over the years has changed. And the news from Beijing has changed over the years.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly will change again. I would say that the Russian state broadcaster is doing exceedingly good work for Mr. Putin, because they are twisting everything,
Yes.
as in the days of the apartheid regime in South Africa. They seem to be doing it more in sorrow than in anger, with the hope that the West will suddenly realise that actually Ukraine shouldn't have the right to decide whether it is an independent country. With my Scottish background, I might have views about that, but we won't go into that here.
Great.
The issue of what an external broadcaster does, I think, is going to become more and more difficult in the future. In a sense, it was much easier when I was a studio manager. We broadcast to East Germany. We knew that in Leipzig, the transmissions on both medium wave and shortwave, they just didn't get through. And that the people in Leipzig were living in the middle of an information black hole, basically. I had personal experience of what communism could be. I'm sure it had a positive side, and sharing and all that. But I had a friend in Aberdeen who had a Czech friend who came to stay with him just after the Soviets had invaded. And Robin asked this Czech friend, "Hasn't your wife and haven't your children come with you?" And no. They were kept basically as hostages in Prague. So the totalitarian side of communism you could see in the 80s, 70s and 80s.
And it's got worse.
It has got worse. I would question whether it's communism anymore.
Oh, it's not communism anymore, no.
It's just totalitarianism.
Yes, quite.
So I was a studio manager for several years, and then an attachment came up, this BBC idea that you go and work for another department for 3 months, and then if you like it, you can try and extend it for 6 months. And if you're really clever, you can extend it up to a year, and then maybe even longer, if you're lucky.
It was a very good system, actually, wasn't it?
It's a very good system, because if you were no good, then you would just go back to your home department, and they'd have to think what to do with you. But it did give you the chance to work your way into a new department, maybe expressing an enthusiasm for the programmes which you knew nobody else wanted to do because they were really boring and unchallenging, and more to the point, really up to deadline. So you'd learn how to do the boring programmes, and then you'd get on to the slightly less boring programmes. And then eventually I stopped being on attachment and got a production job, and had an idea for a series. I knew that in colleges and schools, music is really good for teaching English. The Beatles were around, a lot of their lyrics were very understandable. So that's pop music. Now, I like alliteration in titles. And the rather over-the-top word to do with teaching is pedagogical. And so I came up with a title, Pedagogical Pop, and a strapline where we explain the words of a pop song. For people learning English as a second or foreign language,
Yes.
we tended to make the distinction between second language learners who would be living in the UK, and that was really more the province of the BBC's continuing education unit, and English as a foreign language, which was anybody learning English outside the UK. It's a kind of rough and ready definition. But we knew from letters that the series went down very well, and we also knew from a Hungarian visitor. English by Radio was based in Bush House, but most of the staff worked in Queen's House, which is halfway up Kingsway.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
No, most people haven't.
A new BBC building.
A new BBC building,
Queen's
28
House.
Kingsway, 55 Lincoln's Inn Fields. And it had a lift, and we were on the 3rd, 4th and 7th floor. we also had production offices down in Bush, where everybody smoked at the time. But one day I was going up in the lift, and there was a young lady, and I started chatting, and she turned out to be a Hungarian teacher of English. Now, this was still mid-70s, when Hungarians were not really supposed to come to London, although a lot of them was doing it. And she said, look, I use this series, Pedagogical Pop, with my school pupils, and I really wanted to leave this bottle of whiskey to thank the people responsible. And I was really glad to be able to say, thank you very much. And
it was my programme.
It was my programme, yes. That was sort of really quite nice.
Yes. Now, in those days, if you were doing programmes for people learning English as a second language, did you speak more slowly? Because I think that's gone, hasn't it?
It has to quite an extent, although we didn't actually speak slowly. I think the word used was clearly.
Yes.
We had a repertory company of 2 pretty well permanent actors and 4 actors on revolving 18-month contracts.
Mm-hmm.
So they did the voicing in most of our programmes. And there were 2 sorts of programmes, all English, which could go anywhere in the world, and bilinguals, where we would have a master script, which the translator from the language section would translate into Polish or Czech or Thai or Burmese or Portuguese for Brazil, yes, or whatever, or Swahili. And then we would go to the studio with pre-recorded inserts of all the dialogues. And typically you'd have sort of fairly simple dialogues pre-recorded, recorded by the repertory company actors, the rep actors, and played in. So you'd have in the studio your Portuguese presenter, a rep actor, and then the insert tape. And it was a very cost-effective way of getting a lot of programmes out. Now, you asked about whether they were spoken slowly. Obviously, they wouldn't be full speed. It had to come out at a natural-ish speed. And we had a fairly set audition for new actors coming on the rep. And we'd ask them to say a line by Chomsky, which is, "Colourless green ideas sleep furiously." Now, that line is grammatically absolutely correct, but is equally totally meaningless. Anyway, we'd get the actors to say, okay, here's this line, we want you to say it with whatever range of emotions we were trying to get from them. And it was a very good way of getting to say, not slowly, but not blurring. And it was that kind of difficult distinction.
Separation of words rather than speed of words.
Not separation, because you want to elide, he's rather than he is. But it has to be done in a way that enables them then to follow a full speed English conversation. So typically during the programme you'd start fairly slow and then move slightly faster.
I see.
Now, in 1989, Bob Marsden and Chris Fairham, who was the programme organiser, came up with an idea for a slow speed news. The American equivalent of English by Radio, which was called VOA, Voice of America, Special English, had a very good department, roughly equivalent to us. And so Chris Fairham and Bob Marsden both had the idea, why don't we do something similar? I kind of got landed with being one of the people putting it into practice, I think partly because I got the newsroom experience as a studio manager. And it was a little bit, not politics, but diplomacy between the newsroom, who didn't want to put out something in Mickey Mouse English, the World Service presentation department, who didn't want to read something at 2/3 normal speed, and us. And the first decision that we made was that we weren't doing what the Americans did, which was to use a simplified vocabulary. But we would go to the newsroom 2 hours before the transmission and translate the news bulletin, the English news bulletin, into, quotes, simple English, or special English we called it. And so we'd actually look at things which might trip up non-native speakers, things like the use of the passive tense, rather difficult tenses, abbreviations. Everybody in Britain knows that number 9 is where the Chancellor lives, but if you are in Ouagadougou, you may just miss this. Anyway, we broadcast it for several years, mainly to China. And I had an interesting experience because I played it to a group of Chinese teachers of English who came over on a visit with the British Council. And not one of them said, "Gosh, that's slow," when I asked them to comment on it afterwards. So they, although they were very fluent speakers of English, they didn't spot that it was actually being read slowly as well as being simplified. Unfortunately, this was getting into the time of John Burt, and so by this stage BBC English was being commissioned to provide programmes, and we were stopped from doing the slow news because it could not be repeated 8 times a day. It was an interesting experiment.
Yeah. So Bert wanted to be able to, you record something and then you play it 8 times a day.
Yeah. The same thing. Which you can't. I think our loyalty was to the World Service newsroom.
Yeah.
Not to Mr. Burt.
No, quite. That's very interesting. So you didn't have a simplified. Well, you did have a simplified vocabulary to some extent, because you were removing.
Because we were all from an English language teaching background.
Yes.
And so you would know which words would come in the sort of top 1,000 words.
Yes. Had you been working abroad very much? I mean, I know you did. You were working abroad.
Yeah.
Before you joined the BBC.
Yeah. My role within the department included sort of academic research and academic contacts, and so I went to quite a lot of the academic or semi-academic conferences because it was a very good opportunity to sort of raise the profile of the department. And what is slightly complicated is to explain that there was radio and television and publication. Radio was grant and aid funded. Some of the publication was as well. The bulk of the publication and the television side was funded by the sale of television series and books and cassettes.
Mm-hmm.
So I might start off with this because it actually led into what I was involved with quite a bit, which was not so much making programmes, television programmes, as showing how they could be used in class. And there was a sort of very, very big project, the Follow Me project, which involved the Council of Europe, European broadcasters, and the BBC, and various other parts of the English language teaching world, like the Cambridge examinations. There's a saying in broadcasting that television is fine, but the pictures are better on radio. And that is absolutely correct. However, television is nonetheless a very good medium for teaching English, because you see people doing things and saying the language in a very natural way. And so in the 1960s, English by Radio, as the department then was, tried to establish a television side. Now, the radio and a few publications were funded by grant and aid from the Foreign Office to the external services of the BBC. Television was possible, but it would have to be self-funded through the sale of television series and books and discs supporting the television programmes. And so a commercial side was set up. And within the department, nobody really knew how the funding exactly worked.
Yes.
I don't think anybody was particularly interested. There was a sort of general understanding that there was a commercial side and the publicly funded side, but there were so many crossovers that this was never a particularly fraught issue within the department. It became so later, unfortunately. The first English by television series was called Walter and Connie. It had glamorous black and white television programmes showing a real-life couple, Walter and Connie, using English in natural situations, maybe slightly slower speech than normal, maybe speaking rather more clearly than normal, but very much ordinary people. And the writer of the series found that he became quite a star in his own right when he was introduced in Europe as the writer of Walter and Connie. So it had a big effect, and television was definitely there to stay. When I joined the department, there was a new project in the offing, and I was attached to it for about 3 years. It was called the Follow Me project. And the Council of Europe, which is a cultural organisation for about 30 or 40 European countries, was redefining what language syllabuses should consist of. Basically, and very simplistically, instead of teaching grammar, nouns, verbs, objects, subjects, and even adjectives, it was looking at what people do with the language and how you could use it to communicate with other people. So the same thing could be used at different levels. So if you wanted to introduce yourself to somebody, you might say hello, if you're a beginner. If you're slightly more advanced, you might say, hello, my name's Hamish, who are you? And if you're really advanced, you might say, my name's Hamish, I've been living here for the last 25 years, and I've done this, that, and the other. Now do tell me about yourself if you've got a moment or so. So the same basic function, but at different levels of linguistic complexity. Anyway, Follow Me was adopted as a project by the Council of Europe, put into practice by the BBC and 2 German broadcasters, North German Radio, Norddeutscher Rundfunk, and Bavarian Broadcasting, Bayerischer Rundfunk, and various other organisations, including Longman publishers. And the series started out in Europe. It was designed not for the elite, but for blue-collar workers who suddenly found that they might need to speak English. And it didn't matter how little they spoke. They wouldn't be expected to learn Shakespeare's speeches by heart, but introducing themselves at a meeting where they were planning a new bridge or something like that would be useful. So, 60 15-minute television programmes, 60 15-minute radio programmes, institutional books for use in schools and colleges, self-study books for people learning at home, and a whole variety of ancillary material, cassettes and so forth. It was a massive project and incredibly successful.
It was called Follow Me.
Follow Me.
And it was partly paid for by Council of Europe, or what?
Council of Europe authorised the establishment of new language levels. They were testing out what they called their threshold level, which was the sort of minimum level that you would need to communicate fluently in a European context. I say European context because, in fact, very soon it flew to the other side of the world, and a lady called Kathy Flower was asked to present a Chinese version of it. She became a star in China through her adaptation and presentation. And there we were working with China Central Television, and they were extremely good at putting out educational broadcasting.
Did you have to go out to these places?
I tended to specialise in Europe. So I think that I never got to Lithuania and never got to Albania. And I never got to Romania, but I think I'd been to most other places in Europe, one way or another.
And you would go and observe, would you, how these programmes were being received, what people were doing with it?
Yes, or there would be usually a view to getting broadcast in that country and getting the series adapted. Now, that could mean a proper full-scale adaptation, which happened in Bulgaria. I found out through the Foreign Office, we were, as a department, wanting to expand a little bit into Eastern Europe, dip our toes into the water there. I managed to get some information from Foreign Office that one of our series had been used in Bulgaria. So I went out and had a rather frosty from the Bulgarian official side, incredibly warm from the television broadcaster's side meeting.
Yes.
I think they didn't know who on earth I was or what I was doing, and I think that I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. What I ended up doing was saying, when I got back, that the adaptation that they'd done was really very good. Very linguistic. Was it all swinging, all dancing? No, they didn't have the technical facilities. But was it good, honest adaptation? Yeah, very much. And that meant that for the next series, we were able to say, go away and do it yourself, because we reckoned that the Bulgarian television had a lot of good linguists and good educators.
So they would adapt your material and to rebroadcast it on their own networks.
Yeah,
that's an interesting model.
Now, not everybody was familiar with that model. A few years after Bulgaria, I went initially to Finland, then I took a 4-hour boat trip to Estonia and spent a week in Tallinn working with Estonian broadcasters. Mm-hmm. This was at the time when Estonia was still the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, but was really trying not to be. And they were gradually breaking away. But anyway, in Tallinn they had extremely good linguists again, and a very good person to coordinate what was going on. Mm-hmm. From there I flew to Moscow, and this was the bit where it all got slightly hairy, and it was prepared in a sense. To take you back a little bit, when I joined the department, the person in charge was somebody called Hugh Howes. And his background was not in education. He'd been in military intelligence in the Far East. He spoke fluent Chinese, and it was through him that we were able to Follow Me on Chinese television. By 1989, he had retired and been replaced by Barbara Goldsmith, who'd been there on the commercial side almost from the start. Now, she was a remarkable lady, very calm, very focused, an exceedingly good negotiator, knew everybody and everything that was going on. There was some governor of the BBC who'd been in MI5 or MI6 or something, and came as part of a new governor's duties to watch Bush House, and came into one of our studios, and I think wondered why we were speaking so slowly. Anyway, inevitably, Barbara got to hear of this and was able to raise it directly with her and explain that there were specific reasons for speaking slowly.
Yeah.
So Barbara had an incredible influence. She heard that a professor from Moscow State University was coming to London and made sure that she got to meet her. This led to me meeting her and then finding myself on a plane leaving Estonia to go over to Moscow. Now, I'd sent a wad of script, a whole box load of scripts and insert tapes through the diplomatic bag, which is great if you have access to it. And so they were waiting for me in Moscow, along with Svetlana Terminasova, her name was, the Dean of the Faculty of Foreign Languages at Moscow State University. And also Konstantin, who was the lecturer that she had appointed to be trained by me as a producer in 1 week flat, as well as recording a whole lot of programs. So, for several days I was closeted in a rather mice-infested studio, going back to my studio manager days and doing dub editing again. I don't know if you remember this. It's where you save tape, and it's an immensely cost-effective way of using tape, but it's quite complex. Anyway, the studio managers that they had in their studio were very good at it. And so we recorded programs, and in the course of this, Konstantin Kostya learned how to produce. However, there was the television side, and so I would go off in the afternoons with Michael Bird from the British Council, at least the British Embassy Cultural Section it was called, to Shabalovka, which is the Soviet television educational broadcasting section, called because of its address. We wanted them to see if we could persuade them to broadcast a cartoon series teaching English for children, and we managed it. And I left it. The head of Shabalovka would direct. Her daughter would be the Russian voice, and one of the English language assistants in Moscow provide the English voice using the model that we'd used before. It worked as a concept, and my next visit to Moscow, I went there quite a bit, I was able to see the difference.
Which years were these?
It was 89 to 91,
so
92.
Perestroika and all that.
Perestroika.
The fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and
very
August the 18th, 1991, which we'll come on to. But first, my next visit at Shabalovka, the television studios, they said, thanks, and held out sacks stuffed with drawings. And these had been sent in by Soviet children. And they referred to the program, Muzzy, and they just gave a totally Russian view, or, well, a Soviet view, I should say, because it was still the Soviet Union, of how these kids imagined things to be. And it was immensely gratifying seeing those sackfuls of paintings from the kids. We then managed to do something that we got the kids to send in questions to Shabalovka for their children's hour, Dziecki Czas, and we got them answered by kids in a London primary school, actually my son's primary school.
So they were writing and asking things about the West.
Yeah. It was, do you like ice cream?
Yes.
Do you have homework? Do you go to the circus? That kind of question. But it was very authentic, I'd call it. I don't like that word, but it was real kids speaking to real kids.
Yes.
So Shabalovka were really pleased with the reaction that they'd had to Muzzy. The radio had been very successful, but it was only broadcast on the internal radio network of Moscow University. And so it would be nice to get it actually on a proper Russian radio station, or a proper Soviet radio station. So I think it was in 1990. On my next trip to Moscow, I wanted to try and see if we could move the radio programs from Moscow State University and their very wide-reaching university radio station onto a proper radio station. And my first attempt involved, through Michael Bird and the British Council, Radio Moscow World Service, who were familiar to a lot of listeners during the Cold War by playing Moscow Nights, da 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 da, as their theme tune. Now, I went with Konstantin Kostya and Michael Bird to the head of Radio Moscow World Service, the equivalent of John Chusa at the time. So quite a senior person, to put it mildly, in a very large office with Lenin at the far end, and put to him the idea that they might like to broadcast BBC English language teaching programmes as part of their output. This was a little bit perhaps verging on the cheeky, but not disrespectful. But I was distantly aware that if BBC Policy and Planning got to hear of it, they might well have had a fit. Anyway, they were very, very nice, and we got quite a long way. But then Michael Bird said, look, there's somebody else. So I went just with Kostya. And whereas the Radio Moscow World Service person had been in a large, large office with an antechamber and the photos of Lenin, this guy looked like a BBC boss in very small, very cramped office. Total shambles, tapes, scripts lying around on the floor.
Yeah.
And he basically said, yeah, why not? But he had some very strong provisos. I thought, here we go, it's going to be because the BBC is a Western broadcaster and all that. Not at all. He said, look, you're doing this with a bunch of amateurs. I know your BBC is a professional organisation, but you're doing it with amateurs. The people that you've got at Moscow University are not professionals. You'd be much better handing it over to us. And we work with Moscow University and use some of their voices, but produce it ourselves in our studios. So that was great with Moscow University because they got something out of it. Very strong link with London. It was great for the Studio Dean, Studio One, because they got to broadcast on the roughly the equivalent of the Today programme, BBC English language teaching programmes, and we made sure that they had programmes that were suitable for them. It was a time when nobody knew what was going on. I fortunately had some Russian which I needed to use. I was staying not in a hotel, where I was supposed to be staying, but in Konstantin's flat while he moved into his parents' flat with his wife. So I found myself going home one night about midnight using the Moscow metro, landing up at this metro station right in the middle of a far-flung district in Moscow, coming out onto the surface, 4 identical tower blocks. Which was mine? I had not got the foggiest clue. Anyway, I eventually found it. Another visit, I was actually staying with Kostya's family. His parents had one of these old communal flats where you shared everything with 2 or 3 families. Another time I was in the British Council transit flat, which had very interesting plumbing. But it was sort of a very optimistic time. I was meeting people who were genuinely committed to opening up, getting a new horizon, finding out what other people are doing in a non-judgmental way, saying, this is what we do, let's hear about what you do. And there was every chance that relations between Soviet Union, which it still was, and the West could have been much, much better. Mm. I don't know what happened.
When it all fell apart.
How did it fall apart? I think other stuff happened. The end of history idea said, well, that's it, no more history. We won the Cold War, and that is a phrase that I think was behind some people's thinking. It was the wrong idea. The idea should have been, how do we maintain friendships which may become fragile and need nurturing? I learned Russian at school. I met with Russians at university and liked them when I met them and liked them in Moscow. And what has happened since then, for me, is a total tragedy.
So this was a unique period when they were interested in stronger bonds with the West. You were
it was totally unique.
Happy with that.
Yeah. And I think what made it slightly different was that we weren't coming in with sort of evangelical fervour, and we were just saying, look, this is what we do. It seems to work sometimes. And making friends. You can get a long way in broadcasting with friendship.
Yes, of course you can. This was seen, though, as useful for Russians to be able to learn English, have stronger ties with the West, because that was the way the politics was going at that time. But they weren't suggesting, why don't you teach the Brits to learn Russian? It was a one-way thing, wasn't it? Sort of imperialism.
Yes and no, because, I mean, again, we knew the Radio Moscow World Service Russian language teaching people, and they hadn't really tuned into the West. To go to the West at the time was still not a crime, but verging on it. You would get a lot of raised eyebrows, and raised eyebrows, you know, in the communist context of the time, were not always what you wanted. And I was aware that the Russian by radio booklets, were very good in their way, but they weren't as slick as Western ones would have been. And so they looked old-fashioned. But underneath that was some very good teaching and some very good ideas. And if things had developed, we would have, I think, have done as we did with the German Deutsche Welle broadcasters, as we did with Mongolian television, but that's another story. We would have taken one of the broadcasters to work with us for a month or so that you get some uniformity in international language broadcasting, language teaching broadcasting. They had in Leningrad, as it still was, a very good educational broadcasting school, which I discovered from my friend in Estonia. So education was taken seriously. I went to virtually every country in Central and Eastern Europe, very often staying with teachers rather than hotels. And what struck me is that on every bookshelf you would get collections of the classics. I just wondered how many people in Britain would have.
Quite. Yeah. Valuing education rather more than we probably do.
Yeah.
Tell me about actually working in Moscow. Were you tailed at all? Were you followed? Were you people keeping their eyes on you?
Oh, yeah.
How did you know?
Right. Czechoslovakia, leading up to the 1989. I'd done a trip to Prague. I met up with the BBC correspondent Harold Briley at the time, and he kind of briefed me. And it was sticky, not helped by the fact that I was staying with a British Council rep, and so I spent one afternoon at the visa registration office, because I should have been staying in a hotel. And this was a sort of criminal offence of, you're not allowed to stay in at somebody's house. So Prague was tricky. Anyway, then came the Velvet Revolution, and I was up in newsroom one day and was listening to the news traffic, and the BBC correspondent in Prague at the time had just had a run-in with the secret police who'd broken his arm. And so this news traffic in Broadcasting House was saying to him, now look, there's going to be another demonstration tonight, and we don't want you to get in any danger, so we don't want you to go near the demonstration at all, because you might get your other arm broken. But just out of interest, how close do you think you could get? So it was that sort of kind of tense atmosphere. But then I was in our production office in Bush House, and phone rang, and it was from Prague. How they got me on that number, I don't know. And I said, "Hi, Hamish, and look, sorry about what happened last time. We weren't sure exactly who you were, and we knew that you were being followed, but that's over now. So, can you come back?" Mm-hmm. And so I found myself on a British Council tour to what was still Czechoslovakia, and it was visited quite soon afterwards by the then Prince Charles, who gave a speech in Brno at an educational conference. Mm-hmm. And I managed to get some money out of the Foreign Office, who were a very good source of money if you needed money for an interesting project, and it wasn't too much. They would quite often stump up. Anyway, what I wanted to do was to get modern English language teaching on television in Czechoslovakia. It's already starting to break apart, but not quite. So I got a Czech film crew, and we filmed Prince Charles, and we filmed the speakers at the conference, and they were able to use it for their English language training programs, which I reckon was a good use of government money.
Very much so. Fascinating time. Instead, you mentioned trouble in Prague, but did you have KGB following you in Moscow?
Probably.
So I mean, you weren't doing anything particularly.
I wasn't. No, I wasn't. At the time I came over from Finland to Estonia, on that boat, it was a 4-hour trip. There was a Bolt who started chatting to me very casually. Now, my boss, Hugh Howes, had got this background in military intelligence. He'd sort of taken me aside one day in a sort of rather avuncular fashion and said, sort of, Hamish, my old boy, I wonder if we could have a little chat. And it was sort of basically on how to recognise a KGB agent. And so I knew that the one on the boat was. And
how did you recognise a KGB agent?
Everything is absolutely perfect. Accent perfect, background perfect, but just ever so slightly too perfect. Anyway, this guy, it was about 18 months later, I was rather exceptionally staying in a hotel because I was with the new head of the department. And he came up to me in a restaurant and said, "Oh, I think we've met each other." Coincidences are one thing, but...
Too much of a coincidence.
Too much of a coincidence, yeah. So this collaboration continued. And then in 1991, we had our annual BBC English Language Summer School, and we were able to bring over to take part in the broadcasters course somebody from Radio Moscow Television, somebody from Radio Moscow Radio, and a Russian presenter. So on the afternoon of the 18th, Sunday the 18th, we gathered them all into a studio in Bush House and recorded the first few programmes of a new English teaching series. Next morning, the news came of the Gorbachev coup, and I was left with 3 very scared Russian or Soviet presenters. 1 radio producer, 1 radio presenter, and 1 television producer. The television producer stayed in his room for 3 days until he saw what was happening. The radio pair were both in floods of tears, and I took them up to the Bush House newsroom, and we listened into the live feeds, and the language that was coming out was stuff that I hadn't heard since the real depths of the Cold War. But it was all very dogmatic propaganda, justifying the people who had been responsible for the coup against Gorbachev. And something rather interesting happened, because I kept them, the Russian presenter and producer, listening to the feeds, and I think it was by lunchtime on the Monday, they said, it's failed. They were picking up stuff that I think the newsroom wasn't picking up, that basically if the authorities were going to really quell the reaction to the coup, they should have cracked down, and they had actually ordered the import of thousands and thousands of handcuffs, and they wanted to clear the prisons to put in all the dissidents who they would be imprisoning. It was, in retrospect, very frightening.
Yeah.
But the Russians sensed far before anybody else that it had failed. And sure, by I think Tuesday lunchtime, or the Wednesday at least, it had failed. And that was when we started getting the stories out. Konstantin Kostya, our sort of by then producer stroke fixer in Moscow, had gone to the White House, the Moscow Civic Center, right in the middle of the rush hour. And when he got there, he found gentlemen of the Moscow Mafia unloading piles of machine guns from their larder, because they reckoned that the Western commercial model was more profitable for them than communism. So they were all in favour of freedom. Gorbachev returned and then eventually was succeeded by Yeltsin, with the results that we know. I saw him once at St. Petersburg, by then airport. He was coming up the stairs.
Yeltsin?
No, Gorbachev.
Oh, Gorbachev.
And I was with a couple of other BBC people, and it was one of those moments where he looked up. He had just a couple of security people with him, not heavy guard, and we'd recognised the patch on his head. And we all sort of smiled broadly at him, and he smiled back. And it was just kind of meaningless, but nice. So we're now getting into the 90s. Eastern and Central Europe wanted to get back to where they had been before they were taken over at the end of the Second World War. They did this very successfully. There was a marvellous Czech producer, Bogachkova. My Czech isn't good, but they have lovely long endings. It's a beautiful melodic language. Anyway, she did an adaptation of the Muzzy series that was basically Czech folklore. And she bust the budget for the next couple of years, but it was a really good cause. By 1992, it was clear that the Soviet Union having ended, it was going to take quite a lot of time to actually put something to replace it back together again. I was already working on another project which had been introduced by Julian Amy, who was by then head of department. He had come to the BBC from Longman Publishers and had a very strong background in dictionary publishing. And he said, why don't we do a BBC English dictionary? And this raised a lot of enthusiasm. It involved scraping out of the worm write once, read many discs, the output of 4 years of World Service Newsroom. We also managed to get output from National Public Radio in Washington, so that in American English, the Scud missiles impacted the Gulf. They wouldn't do that in English. They would fall into the Gulf, but you wouldn't use impact as a verb. We also had a lot of encyclopedic information. That was kind of my baby, because we were working with Collins Birmingham University International Language Database, CoBuild, who produce a marvellous dictionary for learners of English, the CoBuild Dictionary. So Collins were really good partners, and we all got on very well together, so that when all the encyclopedic information was just about ready to go forward to the next stage, I was able to phone through to Collins and say, hang on a second, that information about one particular African country as it happened, Newsroom thinks there's going to be a coup there next week, so can we hang on and not put that in the encyclopedic information? The encyclopedic information was fairly basic, but included phrases like Cyprus is a country in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, if you're a Greek Cypriot, saying that it is in the Eastern Mediterranean implies perhaps that Turkey has more rights to it than perhaps it may have. Gosh, I'm hedging this around. So that virtually every country, there were a lot of anxieties within the Bush House section. And I was quite careful not to step on too many toes. Anyway, the dictionary was published.
So this was one dictionary?
One dictionary.
About BBC English, as it were, but it had to work in a whole range of different countries.
It had...
So there were sensitivities there.
There were sensitivities,
yeah.
And the final say on the encyclopedic entries lay not with us, not with CoBuild, but with the individual section head. So they had to approve the... I felt sorry for the Latin American sections, who had an awful lot of countries to look after.
Yes.
And also, actually, for the East European, because would you say Moldova, Moldavia, the Moldovan stroke Moldavian Republic? Nobody at the stage still quite knew what the titles for the new post-Soviet countries were going to be.
Yes.
So yeah, they published it, and it sold very well.
Still going? Still going?
No. It would need to be updated. I think that a lot of it would be possible to update, but the structure for it was destroyed when, in the middle of the 1990s, the department was split again, and the commercial side was just chopped off, and a new commercial side was made in BBC Enterprises, which didn't have any links with Bush, and it folded or was taken over a few years later. So it was all a rather unhappy.
That's very
end.
sad, yeah.
It was very sad, yeah.
What did you do towards the end of your career?
Right. I retired at the end of 2004. I have quite a wide-ranging family, including a cousin who is Canadian but lives in America, although he's mainly in Vienna now. And he was over and talking about, in the early 90s, about 1992, about this thing that he'd just heard about called the internet. And basically, it seemed interesting, and so I kept in touch with him. Then discovered that other people had been doing it in Eastern Europe for ages, with things like FidoNet, bulletin boards.
Yes.
And I think once you've been a studio manager, you have the slight urge to fiddle. I wouldn't really recommend it, but if you see a button which says "Don't press," what are you going to do?
Of course.
Anyway, John was coming over and staying with an aunt of mine, and he would unplug her telephone from the wall and plug in his computer and do things. And my aunt, I think, was slightly shocked at his disrespect for the post office. I was kind of intrigued and started tuning into what was going on the educational side. And then we were getting networked. But it was a totally new way of working, sharing. Why should I want anybody else to see what I am working on in my project? And so networked working needed quite a lot of cautious introduction. And we still didn't quite know what the internet could do. But I started planning, and there are three key people in this. First is Chris Westcott. He was head of science unit in Bush World Service Science Unit, then went on to head BBC monitoring. He managed to get the case through for a World Service internet site. Now, this was going to be very basic, and it would involve him every day taking a CD over to Television Centre where it would be uploaded. I think literally using the central line, so not exactly high tech. But he managed to get multimedia machines. He got 12 in the building, gave one of them to us, and so we started playing with it, and then had computer support coming down and saying you can't do that. But I maintained my links with computer support, so I was able to say, well, how about we do this? They were desperate about viruses getting in, and I can completely understand them. But we needed to experiment, and we needed to get pages up. And Chris Westcott did some templates. I'd come across SGML through publishing, which is Standard Generalized Markup Language, which is linked with HTML, but isn't quite the same. But, the concept of markup. But HTML seemed to come in two varieties. One was an 800-page book, and the other was a sort of very easy, basic introduction. So I had the two books. I gave the 800-page one to Katie Barrett, who's the second of the three people, who was working as the BBC's first English teaching web assistant. So the third person in this triangle, Karen Chilton, who was a science background, had worked in the science unit with Chris Westcott. She gave us permission to upload pages ourselves, which in BBC terms is pretty incredible. Yes. It's like having an open mic, which is a responsibility, so you don't take it lightly. The reason we got that permission is because Katie had shown that she was able to code sufficiently well to guarantee no foul-ups on the page design. And we had the templates, so we were able to get a lot of content up very quickly, all hand-coded.
How was this website material integrated with broadcasting itself? I mean, was this supportive material?
It was started out as support material, except that if you're doing support material, what you really want is things like frequency schedules. Frequency schedules are incredibly difficult to do in HTML, and we kept getting them wrong, and it wasn't the kind of information that was necessarily suitable, and so we gave up and did text. this was still glamorous, sort of black and white, or black and grey. We heard that people were starting to get audio up, and so we put in for this and started getting audio very soon using the existing programs. Having been through copyright, and I had several interesting conversations with the copyright department, I didn't want to have anything on the site that hadn't been cleared for copyright or hadn't been deemed to have been cleared for copyright, which is a weasel word for saying that we would have if we could have, but we've put it up. Now, for new contributions, because I knew that we needed new contributions, we needed a contract, and we had no budget to pay, but a lot of people wanted to come on, academics and so forth, and teachers, and we wanted to have them on, so we wanted a no-fee contract, and I asked copyright to produce a no-fee, very simple contract. By the 18th page of it, I was despairing, and the rights even unto the 7th generation there.
Yes.
And then we had a piece of paper that people could sign, but that was important. I had another interesting discussion with Top of the Pops, actually, about they were quite keen to get a version of Top of the Pops on World Service. So I got through to the legal and copyright again, and they said no. And I said, what about 30 seconds? Well, if you really must, but we'd prefer you not. I then kind of ruined their day by saying, okay, so we've got this 30 seconds, so if we then had the next 30 seconds and 30 seconds after that, at that point they put the phone down, but I got my 30 seconds. Yes. So we managed to get music on, and that was one of the drivers. They used to say at the time that one internet year was 4 Earth years, and it seemed to be. Things were moving really incredibly fast.
Yes.
And you had problems the whole time. It was a great period, actually.
But it was a pioneering period, so exciting in that sense.
Yeah. I remember sort of sitting in my office about 11 at night, and I had to get a page up, and I had to put a link on the World Service homepage. And given that nobody will be listening to this for 30 years or so, I confess here and now that I inadvertently wiped the World Service homepage. Not for very long, and I did manage to get it back. But
you did manage to get it?
I did manage to get it back. Now, I've said that we had very strong links with the British Council, and when internet came along, we did a lot of joint work. So a site for teachers of English would contain content from both BBC and the British Council. This led to one rather unfortunate incident, as far as I'm concerned, when I was rung up at about 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I said, "This is the Director General's office. Are you responsible for..." and he named the website. And I had to say, well, why? Possibly. And it turned out that the British Council had taken some of our content, reworked it, and inadvertently libelled somebody. And yeah, it can happen. And we managed to avoid getting blamed, which I was very pleased about. But
at the time it was...
At the time, Friday afternoon, no one... I do not recommend phone calls from the Director General's office.
So you got involved with the internet towards the end of your career and
yep.
You set up these linked pages which related to the broadcasting,
yeah,
and were international.
Yeah.
So that's very important. How did your career come to an end? Was it planned?
What happened was that first thing was that we started generating content purely for the web.
Yeah.
Very, very soon. I'd been involved in a whole lot of European Commission multimedia projects, language technologies, the precursors for Alexa and things like that. So I was aware of what other people were doing, and that was incredibly useful. And I was also aware that mobiles were being more and more used. So in the same way that we'd got stuff on internet when it was I was told by a very senior BBC person that what I was doing was not a core activity. I felt that I was right and they were wrong. And the same thing happened with mobile. I was on one of the European Commission projects about mobile learning, and went off to a conference and came back with really, we can do something with this. And then something did happen, and so we had a project with Sinner.com, and I really ended my BBC career back where I started, in a self-op, editing content in a language which I didn't understand. So it was fun. It was, I think, gloriously non-managerial, I would describe it.
Yes. But very, very important. And of course you were, I mean, as with all things to do with the World Service, you had enormous audiences.
We had massive, massive, massive audiences.
Yes. And the feedback?
Good. I mean, not always, but it was an engagement. It was actually important. I felt it was always important to respond. And
yes.
There was, one of my original pedagogical pop programs was broadcast on medium wave. It was picked up by somebody who wrote in and complained about it. And I thought, what do I do? And I thought, no, I'm going to write back and explain, look, sorry you didn't enjoy it, but it was intended for people who are learning English. And it was broadcast on a medium wave frequency that they might well hear in the morning for them, although it's pretty much the middle of the night for you. So sorry and have a nice day. A charming letter back. And it was an old guy, and he said, look, I'm sorry about that. My arthritis was getting to me. And I just listened to World Service in the middle of the night, so do understand what you're on about.
Yes, good. But it's important that BBC management knew how big your audiences were.
Yeah, I actually, when the internet started, I again had my contacts with the computer support people, and I knew about server log statistics and how this was going to be the new measure for how you were judged.
Yes.
And initially, English teaching was just lumped in with all the other World Service programs. And without making a big fuss about it, I managed to get the English language teaching bit put in a completely different section.
Oh, you could strip them out, could you?
I could
yes.
strip them out, and so they showed up separately. And because they went pretty stratospheric.
What sort of numbers are we talking about?
I can't say, because of the actual page impressions, the way of judging them. But there was a graph, is it going up? And if so, how steeply is it going up? And that was what I think meant, well, there's still an English language teaching unit in World Service. So
there still is.
There still is.
Ah, so
it hasn't been cut yet.
So your work continues, but in other hands.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Hamish. That was very interesting.